Well, good morning. Just let these little ones and big ones wander out. I brought eight with me. My wife is the beautiful avocado sitting near the back there. She's pregnant with our number 9, and he has. I hope that's for my wife because she's the one doing most of the work there. What a great intro. I didn't expect that particular song to be sung right before, but that, I would say, if you want to encapsulate the opposite of everything that Jesus criticizes in the text that we just read, it's in that song. All the way to the cornerstone, I think, statement of what we read there at the end of Matthew chapter 23, where the last woe that Jesus says to them is the statement that they were decorating the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. And that song reflects the exact opposite of that it was my mocking voice, that called out on Jesus. So there's a very clear juxtaposition here between what Paul wrote, what that song was written after, and the criticisms that Jesus is going to bring to bear upon the Pharisees in this text. So let's talk about context for a minute. We find ourselves in Matthew chapter 23. We find ourselves in the last week of the life of Jesus prior to his crucifixion. We're in Passover week. The location that we pick up in the text is the temple. He's been in the temple now teaching for a bit. Last week you heard from Carl, I know. I wasn't able to be here and hear that message, but I know he preached on Matthew 22 where he was in the temple and the questions ended, right? They were dialoguing throughout the book of Matthew, and we get to the very end of it, and Jesus finally answers their questions sufficiently to shut their mouths, and it says in verse 46 of chapter 22, and no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare ask him any more questions. Dialogue was over. He was done talking to them. They were done talking to him. The relationship was done, if you will. Whatever it was, whatever interaction the Pharisees had with Jesus, it was done. And now Jesus is going to turn and he's going to speak to two different audiences. First, we're going to see him in the first 12 verses. We're going to see him speak to the disciples and the crowd that was there. Actually, it says crowds, plural. We'll talk about that in a second, but a huge number of people likely. And he's going to criticize the Pharisees. They were probably right there standing there, but he's talking about them, not at them. And then he's going to turn eye to eye, and he's going to make 7 statements to them. We have them encountered in verses 13 through 36 as woes, which isn't necessarily a word we use often in English, but it was a pronouncement of judgment, a cursing, a statement of deep distress upon them. In fact, in the Greek, it was a word that was, I'm going to butcher this word, onomatopoeic word? I don't know. Anyway, it's that. So it's like wham or bam or words that sound like something. It was a guttural ooh-I. It was this statement that came from the gut that was woe to you, judgment coming, cursing upon you for these things. And he's going to make these statements leveled directly at the Pharisees. Now, this week was very busy in Jerusalem. This would have been the Passover week. And according to the law, you were to go and do a ritual cleansing for a week prior to the Passover. So those that were going to Jerusalem for the Passover, they already would have been there. The temple would have been the center point of where they would have been. So likely there would have been a massive throng of people, and it would have been people represented from all over Israel and even beyond that. Josephus, a historian that was contemporary to the time, wrote of people coming from Babylon and Egypt, and the population of Israel, or of Jerusalem, swelling to 2 million inhabitants, which would have been massive for that size city and in that day and age. So likely a crowd that represented Judaism across the known world was there to hear this message. It would have been probably odd if you were an adult in Israel in that day and age to not have heard about what Jesus said here. This would have been the headline. This would have been the thing that everybody would be talking about as the religious institution, the Pharisees, the primary people that were guiding the nation of Israel at that time, were getting absolutely torn limb from limb by what Jesus says here. And just to make sure that we don't miss the importance of what Jesus is saying, I want to go back real quick all the way to Matthew chapter 3, And I want to point out how Jesus' ministry starts. Okay, Matthew 23, turn there real quick with me. We see John the Baptist come onto the scene. Matthew 3, he's baptizing people. And this is the opening scene to Jesus' ministry. We see him show up in verse 13. It says, then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to John to be baptized by him. And right before that, John is going to speak a message to the Pharisees. In verse 7, we're going to pick up. He says, but when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, you brood of vipers. Sound familiar? Similar words being spoken, right? Who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bear fruit in keeping with repentance. And do not presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father, for I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children for Abraham. Even now the axe is laid to the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. And then he's going to go on to talk about baptism coming with the Holy Spirit and fire. Verse 12, his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the barn. But the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. So notice this for a second. Jesus' earthly ministry, his public ministry, starts there, with the Pharisees being warned and called out for who they were right at the very beginning. And then now we are all the way in Matthew chapter 23, and this is the last message you're going to see Jesus address the public with. Everything after this point is going to be private ministry. He's going to be talking to his disciples. He's going to be going to the cross. He's going to be rising again from the dead. But all of that is private interactions that he's having with his disciples. This is the last thing we're going to see him address publicly. His ministry starts by addressing the Pharisees, and it's going to end by addressing the Pharisees. They stand out as this type, if you will, of everything that Jesus was not and everything that he desired the nation of Israel wouldn't be and would flee from and would turn to the true and living God. But they stood there as the archetype of all those things. But I think there's a temptation here for us. And the temptation is this. We could read this text and we could study it and we could watch it kind of like a train wreck unfolding, kind of enjoying it, right? My kids will tell you I like to, guilty pleasure here, I like to watch YouTube and watch car accidents on YouTube for some reason. I don't know why. If you've ever done it, you know, there's a lot of them out there. But this is kind of like that, right? Like you're watching, you're disconnected from it. It's easy to kind of stick the Pharisees in a box or in a cage, look at them like a weird zoo animal and say, wow, can't believe they did that. Can't believe they said those things. Can't believe they wanted to kill Jesus. I wouldn't have been like them. And I think there's that temptation. But if we, let me actually turn there real quick. I wasn't going to take you there right now, but let's do it anyways. Let's go to Luke chapter 11. Luke chapter 11, Jesus is going to make some very, very similar statements. Let's see here. Let's pick it up in verse 37. I'm just going to skim with me here real quick. The Pharisees, he's going to address the Pharisees again, and this time they're eating at a table. And the Lord says in verse 39, Lord said to him, now you Pharisees, cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside are full of greed and wickedness. Sound familiar? Verse 40, you fools, did not he who made the outside make the inside also, but give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. But woe to the Pharisees, listen to this again, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb, sound familiar? And neglect the justice and love of God, something he says over in Matthew 23. Fast forward, woe to you, verse 44, you are like unmarked graves. People walk over them without knowing it. Similar statement to Matthew 23. And he continues on there saying these things over and over again. Similar woes, he says 6 of them in this passage, not 7. And then he gets down to chapter 12, and it says this, in the meantime, when so many thousands of people had gathered together that they were trampling one another, so similar context, right, in these crowds, he began to say to his disciples first. Notice that for a second. Who's the audience? People that were following Jesus, right? We would want to categorize ourselves as one of them. And he says this, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So church, what I want us to have our eyes fixed on and be looking at this passage through is the lens of being aware that whatever the Pharisees stood for there, they're going to get their criticisms and they're going to get their judgments. But the leaven, the thing that was infecting them, is just as much a risk to us today as it was to them then. We need to be aware of the leaven of the scribes and Pharisees. We need to be aware and vigilant regarding hypocrisy. And I'll make this statement, something I've come to believe. Let me study this and meditate on it for a bit. We just went through an election, and there's been a lot of talk, especially in Christian circles, of the culture that we're in. We see a lot of things that are grievous to us. The LGBTQ movement, the woke ideology, liberalism, progressivism, all these things that seem to stand against what most conservative Christians, let's say, I'll put it in that category, would believe, and things that grieve the Lord, and those things are all true. But here's what I want to say. The thing that threatens us in our Christian walk, and the thing that stands as a threat to the church, is not the culture. The culture has always stood against the church. The culture stood against Jesus. For the last 2,000 years, it has been no different. We should expect it to be no different. The thing that stands against the church and stands against us as individuals is the threat of hypocrisy. That's the thing that we need to guard against. That's the thing that the Lord is warning us of here, and we're going to see in this passage. Now, the passage is quite long, so I'll warn you right now, I am not going to be able to unpack all of it, not even close. I'll probably spend most of the time actually in the first 12 verses, but encourage any conversation we might have afterwards, or of course, continued conversation down the road. But let me give you a quick outline. So the first thing we're going to see here is we're going to see a call to humility in the first 12 verses. The second thing we're going to see is the Lord calling us away from hypocrisy. So a call to humility and calling us away from hypocrisy. Let's look first in chapter 23, verse 1. It says this: Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach, but do not practice." Let's pause there for a second, because right off the bat, I can tell you when I started studying this, that was immediately something that tripped me up. What do you mean, Jesus? You want me to do and observe whatever they tell you? I went and looked at that in the Greek. Sometimes you go and look in the Greek and you find a way of scrolling out of whatever's being said there. But it's quite emphatic. Do and observe. The word do is to do it immediately. Observe is the word to keep doing it. So Jesus is saying, whatever they tell you, do it and keep doing it. That's kind of an odd statement that Jesus is making, right? We just got done looking at how he's going to dress down the Pharisees and how they're filled with hypocrisy and pride and all these things. So what do you mean, Jesus, to do and keep doing what they tell you? The key here is context. Look back in verse 2. The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Here's what I think Jesus is saying here. Inasmuch as they are teaching the Scriptures, the authentic Word of God, the words of Moses, listen to them. But watch out, because they preach, but they do not practice those things. And here's why I think Jesus is warning. He is going to so thoroughly dress down the Pharisees, and he's going to tear down what they stand for and how they live, and he's going to undermine them and call them all sorts of things that are detestable and we would never want said about us. I think there would be a potential here that some in the crowd would hear the things being said to the Pharisees and want to reject everything they've ever said. And I see that tendency in Christianity, where we'll have a leader that will be respected and well regarded, and there will be some great fall from sin or from something, and people will walk away from everything they've said. They'll discount everything that ever came from that source. And we have to be careful with that, because the things that are said from the Scriptures are spoken in the authority of the Scriptures. The Lord's word is true, even if it's being said from a liar. We have that, I think, a contemporary, how many of you know Ravi Zacharias? Some of you know him, great apologist of the faith, just had a huge fall after he died. It came out that there was tremendous sin in his past. Everything that he said is not inherently evil because of that. The Scriptures are still true. And I believe Jesus here is warning them, don't throw the baby out with the dirty bathwater. Keep the things that they've spoken in the authority of Moses, but watch out, because they preach, but they do not practice. So first of all, in pride, they misrepresent God's law. So we see, first of all, in pride, they misrepresent God's law. They preach, but they do not practice. When we speak the truth and then we go and walk away and do something totally different, we're giving a false image of what the Scriptures are teaching, right? So they are misrepresenting God's law in what they're doing. The second thing they're doing is they're adding to the Scriptures, and they're doing so without any care to help the people. Look at verse 4 with me. It says, they tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with a finger. We see examples of this already in Matthew. Matthew chapter 12, we have the story of the disciples and Jesus walking through a field on the Sabbath. They're hungry, and they're picking little heads of grain and eating those heads of grain, and the Pharisees criticized them for harvesting on the Sabbath. They were saying, you're breaking the law. It wasn't the law. That was their addition to the law. They were putting extra burdens, extra things on top of the law that they were trying to find to accuse Jesus and the disciples of. They also talked about him not healing on the Sabbath. Then in Matthew chapter 15, we see an interaction. Go there with me real quick. Matthew chapter 15, verse 1. Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? Extra burdens, extra laws. For they do not wash their hands when they eat. Little ironic criticism in today's day and age. Wash your hands, wear a mask, wash your hands, wear a mask. And he answered them, verse 3, and why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? And then he goes on to talk about how they were dishonoring their mother and father. They created loopholes in the law to be able to not obey the Lord. And he says this, he quotes Isaiah, skip down with me to verse 8 and 9. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So they were adding to the Scriptures, and they were doing so without any care to help or any desire to help. Look at the second part of verse 4 there. It says they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. It doesn't say they can't move them or they don't have the ability to move them. It says they are unwilling to move those extra burdens. So here they're creating extra burdens and piling it on the people, and they're unwilling to go and address those burdens. And let me submit to you, that stands in direct contrast with Jesus' promise to the people. He says in Matthew 11, anybody know it, verse 28 through 30? Anybody? You'll recognize it when I say it? Keep going.
For I am lowly and gentle, and you can come unto him and to rest, and be equally yoked. His way is light, and that's already part of what I was going to share. So
there you go. Perfect. Right. Yeah. So Jesus' burden is light. His yoke is easy. His burden is light. And it says, and he will give you rest. So consider that for a second. Not only is his burden not heavy, not only is his burden not going to exhaust you as quickly, his burden is light, and it's actually going to give you rest. Right? So we find rest in him. So what is Jesus doing? Look at the direction he's walking in. Jesus is walking towards less burden, more help. The Pharisees are walking in the direction of more burden, less help. In fact, in Galatians chapter 6, the New Testament tells us that we are to carry one another's burdens, and so what? Anybody know? Fulfill the law of Christ, right? So the law of Christ is summed up in carrying one another's burdens. So you can see these things opposed to each other, right? They're adding to the law. They're doing so without caring to help the people that they're supposed to be shepherds of. The third thing we see here is they then distort God's law. Look with me on in verse 5. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. So let's just pause and talk about that for a second. I don't think that's just a nuanced kind of detail that Jesus puts in here. Two things he lists, phylacteries and fringes. First of all, phylacteries were this, I would say, misrepresentation of what God intended in the Old Testament. It talks about them keeping God's law on their foreheads and their hands, and what they would do is they would take leather boxes and literally put God's law on their forehead, and they would strap it to their arm, thinking that was fulfilling what God wanted them to do. In reality, what it was saying, and it's a clear, I think it's pretty clear in Exodus where they initially get it from, and then in Deuteronomy, Exodus 13, if you want to look it up later, Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 11, it's an analogy, it's an allegory. God is saying, remember these things. Keep them in your minds. Do them. Keep them in your hands. He's telling them to remember the law of God and to remember specifically their deliverance from slavery. Again, Exodus 13, Deuteronomy 6 and 11, you can look that up later. But remember the law and deliverance from slavery. The second thing he mentions here, so their phylacteries, and it says, and their fringes long. Now this was part of the law, Numbers chapter 15. Let me read it to you real quick. You can turn there if you want to, but Numbers 15, verse 37. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, find it here. 15, verse 37. Listen to this. So this is something that Jesus would have obeyed, right? So if you met Jesus when he was walking on the earth, he would have had tassels or fringes on his garments. It says in verse 37, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner. And it shall be a tassel for you to look at, and listen to this, and remember all the commandments of the Lord and to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. Listen to the language God, in that case, God uses in the text there. So have these tassels, have it so that you remember, they're a testimony to you of the commandments of God, and to remember not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes. Just total aside here. Parents, watch out for the messages your kids are getting in Disney movies. Follow your heart, follow your heart, follow your heart. God has some pretty strong words right here for that. We're inclined to whore after that, he says. God never tells us to follow our own heart. He tells us to follow his heart. So these tassels were to be a reminder. So here we have this picture. They're making their phylacteries broad. They're making these boxes on their foreheads bigger and bigger and bigger. They're making their fringes longer. These things that were meant to be a reminder to them of God, and instead they became a means of self-glory, a means of drawing attention to themselves. And then it says they do all their deeds in verse 6, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. So here you have this picture of these Pharisees that were taking the law, they were adding to it, they were misrepresenting it, they were distorting it, and they were completely clouding people's ability to see the Lord through the law. Let's just camp there for just 2 seconds. I want to spend 2 seconds there. What is it about the law that was good? What was the ministry of the law to the people? If you were to summarize it, anybody have any ideas? I'd like to have a little bit of dialogue here. Gets a little lonely up here. Okay, humbles us, forces us back to repentance. It acts like a mirror, right? We get to look at the law. We get to see how we can't follow it. We're unrighteous. We need a Savior. We need somebody to come along and forgive our sins and to pay for those things in a permanent sense, right? The law did that. It was a mirror for us. Why else did we have the law? What was the second ministry of the law? Anybody remember? All right, let's go there. Deuteronomy 6. Go with me real quick. Deuteronomy 6. You're all thinking, there is no way we're getting out of here today at this rate.
Paul said that he wouldn't know what sin was.
Yep, and informed us. Yep, informed us. Yep, we know what sin is through the law. It gives us knowledge of sin. Okay, so first of all, it reveals our sinfulness. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 6. Let's pick it up in verse 17. Here we go, 17. This is the beginning of the law. This is a very famous passage, by the way. The beginning of chapter 6 has the Shema in it, which is the statement that the Israelites would have opened their meetings in the synagogues, closed their meetings in the synagogues. To this day, a good Jewish kid will go to bed reciting this as the last thing they say during the day. It's back in verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It was kind of their cry of distinction from the rest of the earth. And then verse 17, we pick it up, and it says this: You shall diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God, and his testimonies, and his statutes. So focus on one word real quick, that word testimonies. That word kind of lost its meaning to me until I started studying this again. And if you carry that forward and you look at the Psalms, the psalmist uses that word to describe the law over and over and over again. In fact, he says it 14 times to describe the law in Psalm 119 alone. He calls the law God's testimonies. They're testifying something to us. Okay? So then keep going. Verse 18. And you shall do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may go well with you, and that you may go in and take possession of the good land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers by thrusting out all your enemies from before you, as the Lord has promised. So it's testifying of what the Lord is doing and going to do here. And it says in verse 20, and this is clutch, when your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you, then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. So it's testifying of God giving us freedom from slavery and his might. Verse 22, and the Lord showed signs and wonders great and grievous against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. It's testifying of God's justice. Verse 23, and he brought us out from there that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to our fathers. It's testifying that God's a promise keeper. Verse 24, and the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as we are to this day. God's law. It's telling us something about God. So yes, it's a mirror to us about ourselves, but it's also a reflection of who God was. It was through the law that they were going to be able to recognize the Messiah when he came. It was through the law they were going to be able to see Jesus and what he was going to do on the cross, and to understand that it was him. It was the one they had waited for, the one that was the sacrifice for them, that was required, that was necessary in the law to forgive their sins. So it's testifying them of God. And here's the point that I want to get to. The reason Jesus has such a significant problem with the Pharisees adding to the law and distorting the law to the people is that they were adding and distorting to the image that was there for them to understand and recognize God. It was like this. God had painted a picture for them. He had said, you're going to know me through this. You're going to recognize me through this. And the Pharisees had gone up to that masterpiece, that painting that was perfect, that gave them everything they need, and they finger painted over it and called it better. And they clouded people's ability to see God through the law. That's what they were doing. And Jesus criticizes them heartily for this. And then he gives us the contrast. And here's the call to us to humility. Verse 8. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Who's that going to be? Jesus. I heard someone said it. Say it louder. There we go. The greatest among you shall be your servant, verse 12. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So what is the antidote to the Pharisees' pride? It's pretty simple, pretty obvious, I would say, but it's humility. Humility is the way Jesus is going to call us back to this view of God that's appropriate and right, brings clarity back to God. John the Baptist says it best. He says, I must decrease so that what? So that he can increase, right? So he calls us in our humility to recognize Christ as our teacher. We're called to equality to each other, brothers, it says, under one Father who is God. Christ flattens the hierarchy, right? He removes that pyramid-shaped hierarchy that the Pharisees were building and flattens it. Effectively, so let me back up. Here's what I think was interesting about it. When I first started studying on this, one of the things I'll do as I start studying is I'll read the scriptures, kind of get a sense of where the scriptures are going, but then I'll start looking at what other people have said about it and reading, what dead people said and what alive people say and all these kinds of things. And one of the things I noticed is a lot of people were talking about how God was tearing down false spiritual leadership and setting up true spiritual leadership, true human institution spiritual leadership. And when I read this, I said, no, he doesn't. He doesn't do that. He tears down false spiritual leadership, and then he sets only himself up as the true spiritual leader. He's not saying, don't look to these guys because they're bad spiritual leaders, look to these guys because they're good ones. He's saying, don't look to these guys, you look to me. That's it. There is nobody else that separates us from Christ, nobody in between us. So humility answers each of the distortions that the Pharisees had here. They distorted God's law. We yield to Christ as our teacher and not presume to add to it. They distorted God's law through their care being indifferent. They did not care for the flock. In humility, we're called to serve one another. They distorted God's law by being motivated by self-glory. In humility, we entrust ourselves to God as our Father and look for His approval, not man's. I remember reading a missionary story a bunch of years ago, And to this day, I can't remember who the missionary even was. He was a missionary to Africa back in the 1800s, and I can't remember his name. But one thing that stuck out in the story, it was a biography, and it was one of those, fun biographies to read where you get a sense of this great testimony what the Lord does through this man. And I like reading those, and I think part of the reason, if I were to be honest with myself, that I enjoy reading those is you kind of get this picture of like, ooh, what if I was like that? What if I was like Nate Saint? Or what if I was like, fill in the blank, right? And I was reading the story of this guy who went to Africa, and it mentions that he went with two friends. So they were on the ocean, sailing for months. They get to the port in Africa. They land. I think it gave the first names of these two friends. They were in like one chapter in the book, and they get on land, and the two friends within weeks are dead. Okay? So he's going to go on to have some great stories about what the Lord's going to do and everything. But what stuck out to me in the story, and really the only detail I even remember to this day about it, was God in that moment as I was reading it saying, yeah, it's one thing to want to be significant for my kingdom, but are you willing to be insignificant for my kingdom? Are you willing to be one of those two friends that their only story, their only footnote in somebody else's story is they went on a boat, they landed, and they died 2 weeks later? That's a harder pill to swallow. But I think that's what Christ is calling us here to, is looking for humility, following Christ to the bottom as servants, and trusting that God is the one who's going to lift us up. So, first thing we're called to, humility. Don't worry, I only have 6 more points. Just kidding. Second thing, God calls us away from hypocrisy. And I'm going to fly through a bit of these because we just aren't going to have enough time to read all of them and get in a lot of depth. But I'm going to fly through these 7 woes one by one and try to categorize them a little bit for us, because I believe Jesus is walking us in a direction as he's calling out these woes to the scribes and the Pharisees. The first 2 woes, let me tell you where I'm going with this. The first 2 woes, he points out the impact of hypocrisy. The impact of hypocrisy. Verse 13, he says, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in." They shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. Second one there, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." So the first thing, the first set of woes I want to point out here is the impact of hypocrisy, that it prevents and it procreates. It stands in the way of people entering, and those that actually do follow it become greater hypocrites. Let me summarize it this way. It steals people from God. It steals people away from God. I remember talking to a customer of mine. I went out to visit him in the Midwest. I believe it was somewhere in the Texas area. And he told me this story. We got talking about religion, and he mentioned that he was a Catholic, but that he used to be part of a Protestant denomination. I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Why the switch? What happened there?" And he told me a story of when he was younger. And when he was in his 20s, he had a heart for young people. He would go to the poor areas of the town that he lived in, and he would pile up these kids in the back of his pickup truck and drive them into church. And that was, his active ministry when he was in his 20s. And the leadership of the church came to him and they said, "Hey, you really can't be putting all these kids in the back of your pickup truck. It's not safe. They need to have seatbelts. They need to be in seats. Got to put them somewhere else." So he said, "Okay, I'll take that on my side, and I'll just make multiple trips." So he made multiple trips back and forth, getting these kids every week. And eventually the leadership came back to him and they said, "Okay, actually you can't be driving these kids in your personal vehicle, so you got to stop doing that." And he said, "Well, we've got this bus sitting in the parking lot, it doesn't run. If I fix that up, can I go get these kids?" And they said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead, fix it up. If you want to fix it up, go ahead." So he goes and he puts in the labor to fix up this truck or this bus, and gets it running and starts picking up kids. And then they come to him again. They say, "Hey, you know what? Actually, you're too young to be driving that bus. You're not able to do it." And he walked away in frustration from that experience, and he turned around, he started walking back to them, and they were around the corner of a building. And as he approached the corner, he overheard them saying, "When will he get the picture that we don't want their kind here?" He had been picking up young black kids in that town and bringing them to church. So what did he do? He walked across the street to the Catholic Church, and they said, "Yeah, you can bring him here." And that's why he was a Catholic. Hypocrisy shuts the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. It's what it does. It doesn't. We don't need to necessarily even understand why it does that or how it does that in every single situation. What we need to accept is Jesus' warning and his rebuke here that the kingdom of heaven is shut in people's faces through hypocrisy of people who claim to be something that they are not. The next two, so the impact of hypocrisy is the first two. The next two here, hypocrisy is evidenced publicly. The first one, we won't read it, but starting in verse 16 through 22, we get this picture of how they were swearing falsely. They were making, I don't know if you had this. I had this experience when I was a kid, but you had, if you crossed your fingers when you said something, you weren't really lying, you kind of just hide your hand behind your back, and you had to, let me see your hands. Are you crossing your fingers? Are you telling me the truth, And it has that kind of feel to it. It's a little bit ridiculous. He's like, if anyone swears by the temple, it's nothing. But if you swear by the gold in the temple, he's bound by his oath. So you're saying that you can lie if you swear by this thing, but not that thing. They were making loopholes in the law to lie. Their hypocrisy was demonstrated in what they were saying. It's evidenced publicly. The second thing he calls out is it's evidenced in what they're doing. Verse 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. So you have these public evidences of hypocrisy. What you're saying is demonstrating your hypocrisy. What you're doing is demonstrating your hypocrisy. It's almost ridiculous. And he draws out the ridiculous nature of it in verse 24. You blind guides straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Kind of a ridiculous picture, right? They didn't have Tupperware in that day. They'd have their water or their wine or whatever in a jar, and they'd go to it, and they have to strain the gnats out probably, And he has this picture of like you're sitting there picking out the tiniest gnat, but then you're swallowing a whole camel. It's a bit of a ridiculous picture. But he's and even what he's saying here, you tithe mint and dill and cumin. Those were spices. They were herbs. So you've got this handful of seeds, and you're like, well, there's my 1/10 of that, and my one. It's this kind of silly picture of how they're being so particular about these fine points, but completely missing the heart of God and the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. So your first two woes, you have the impact of hypocrisy. The second two, you have the evidence of it publicly. And then the third is that you have the evidence of it privately. Then he goes on to verse 25. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside are full of greed and self-indulgence. He points out their evil motives. Verse 27, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness, a word that is most often in the New Testament attributed to sexual impurity. He says in verse 28, so you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. So your evidence is public, your evidence is private, it's hidden sin, it's evil motives. I remember hearing a message when I was young, when I was in my teens. I heard a sermon preached, and this was the unregenerate Dan. So maybe I misheard what the preacher was saying. But what I heard, I'll tell you what I heard. What I heard was he made a comment. He said everybody has skeletons in their closet, and that for whatever reason stuck out to me as well. The preacher said that, so it must be okay. And on ensued years of my life of keeping skeletons in my closet, hidden sin. Hypocrisy keeps hidden sin around. You don't need to have skeletons in your closet. No one's told you that. Let me tell you that. You do not need to have skeletons in your closet. So, hypocrisy is evidenced publicly, it's evidenced privately, and the last thing here is it's evidenced in self-deception. Verse 29, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and you decorate the monuments of the righteous. So what's going on there? They're putting flowers on the gravestone. They're making the monuments of the righteous pretty, and they're doing it publicly so everybody sees what they're doing. And they're saying this in verse 30, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. And he says this, thus you witness against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. So what were they doing? They were making a show of decorating those monuments, and they were claiming that they wouldn't have taken part in the shedding of the blood, and in doing so, they were witnessing against themselves. And I believe that hypocrisy here is evidence in the self-deception that happens when you allow the hypocrisy to live in your life, but you think you're still okay. You think you're still good. We're about to take the Lord's Supper in a little bit here. Don't think you're okay if you have hidden sin. Do not do that. There's actually a pretty close corollary here. Let's turn there real quick. 1 Corinthians 11. I think it's similar enough that you'll see it. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Hope I'm not stealing your thunder here. Let's see here. Let's look at verse 27 here. Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. But if we judged ourselves truly, we would not be judged. Do you see the similarity here? They were not judging themselves truly. They were making false claims. We're okay. We wouldn't have killed the prophets. They weren't looking in the mirror to make sure that they were actually clean. That's the call to us as believers. Make sure you are actually clean before you come to the table. Judge yourself. Let me just catch up on my notes here. I have no idea where I am. Let me submit to you a connection here with the text that I'll leave with you, and you can go look at it yourself. Jesus references that they're going to be held accountable for the blood of Abel to the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah. And I found that to be an interesting reference point. First of all, we don't have any record of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, who is the prophet Zechariah that wrote that book. We don't have any record of him dying. So first of all, some critics of the scriptures will actually say, well, maybe they got the name wrong. There is another Zechariah in the Old Testament that did die in this manner, but not Zechariah the son of Berechiah. But if you look at the Old Testament, you also find that there's about, I think, 27 or 28 Zechariahs. There's a lot of Zechariahs anyway. That could have certainly died the same way. But anyway, he calls out the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah. And then in finding that interesting, I decided I was going to start reading Zechariah just to see, and I could not put the book down. I couldn't put it down because there were so many similarities to what was happening here in exactly what was happening here in Matthew and what we're about to see in the crucifixion. I mean, you have his different things about his death foretold. He's pierced through. He's going to come and forgive the iniquity of us all in one day. It talks about 30 pieces of silver being his price. It talks about him showing up on the foal of a donkey. So it has all these reference points that tie directly into the part of the story that we're in. And it even foretells these Pharisees. It talks about shepherds who are consuming the flock, shepherds who don't care and don't have pity for the sheep, things that we're seeing here happen in this text. And then it goes, I think it's in chapter 5, it gives two cursings. And they're interesting because they seem a little bit out of place as you read the book, but not if you take it in context of chapter 23 here. The two cursings are this. One, people who steal, and the other one, people who swear falsely. Look back to the woes. The first two, what are they doing? They're stealing people from God. The next five, what are they doing? They're swearing falsely. They're lying. They're misrepresenting God. They're doing it publicly in what they say. They're doing it publicly in what they do. They're doing it privately in their motives. They're doing it privately in their hidden sin. And they're doing it, and they're lying to themselves even in their own lack of self-examination of who they are in the face of the prophets. They're stealing and they're lying. Let me take you back to Luke chapter 2 real quick, and then we'll close on this. Sorry, Luke 12, not 2. I want to go back to that statement about hypocrisy that he put in here. So Luke 12, the second part of verse 1 there, it says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." And then this is the follow-up statement that we need to make sure we do not miss. "Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and whatever you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops." So let's not be deceived about something here. Hypocrisy has absolutely no place in a believer's life. The first few woes that he says, they're a little hard to attach yourself to. I don't talk about finding loopholes, and swearing about the gold of the temple. I can't relate to that. But then he gets a little closer to home, right? And what you do. Okay, sometimes I'm a hypocrite in what I do. And then he gets a little closer to home, my motives. Geez, yeah, I could be a hypocrite in my motives sometimes. Hidden sin. That hits home to a lot of people. We cannot let hypocrisy live within our lives, within the church. 1 John chapter 1 says this, God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin. So what God calls us to is walk in the light. Reject hypocrisy. Don't give way to it. What does it do? It steals from God. What does it do? It lies about God. It misrepresents him. It puts barriers in the way of people knowing him, and it puts barriers in the way of you knowing him. We cannot allow hypocrisy to live in our lives. I love how Paul says it, and I'll end on this. Paul says that his prayer for us, and I'll skip to the end here, is that we would be found pure and blameless on the day of Christ. That's Philippians chapter 1. Be found pure and blameless. That word pure is awesome in the Greek. It just means a scroll unfolded to the sun's light. And the picture there is simple. We're all scrolls. We're all wrapped up in this package that we know what's on the inside. No one else knows what's on the inside. We know what's hidden. No one else knows what's hidden. But the promise to us is that someday God's going to take us as a scroll and he's going to unravel us. Is what's in the middle of that scroll the same thing that's on the outside of the scroll? Or are we walking around with hypocrisy? Remember, number one thing that threatens the church, number one thing that threatens us, hypocrisy. If you are hiding some sin today, if you are holding on to that in your life, let me gently call you, repent. You do not need to do that. The Lord called me into his light when I was 19 years old. I had lived a life of hypocrisy. I had tons of hidden sin in my life, but I looked great on the outside. I'd gone to Word of Life, by the way. You guys do a lot of stuff with Word of Life. I've gone to Word of Life for 2 years, and it wasn't until the last week of my time at Word of Life that the Lord cornered me in the family campground. If you've been there, who's been to the family campground? The nursery at the family campground. I went in there one night in the pitch black and for 2 hours wrestled with the Lord, and the Lord came and called me into the light with my sin. And for the first time, I found freedom. I lost everything. I got kicked out of Word of Life. There you go. You didn't know your teacher this morning was somebody who got kicked out of Word of Life. Now you do. But I got kicked out of Word of Life, and I'd love to share my testimony with you someday. It's certainly longer than this. But I found out that you didn't need to live with skeletons in your closet anymore. Amen. There is no reason. And I found that was the true power of salvation in that moment is when I walked out and I confessed my sin. Sin no longer had a grip on me. I didn't stop sinning, but I no longer had the handcuffs of sin. And if you're still living and walking with the handcuffs of sin around you, you don't have to. Step out into the light. And I'll submit to you, if you want to know exactly what it looks like to resist these things, Luke chapter 2 is going to give you 3 things. And I'll just give this to you as an outline. You can go look at it yourself in Luke chapter 2, verse 4 and on. It's this: fear God, submit to Christ as your Lord, your master, the one who's sovereign, who gets to decide. You don't get to decide anymore, he does. And yield yourself to the Spirit. Fear God, Jesus is Lord, yield to the Spirit. That's how we fight hypocrisy. Amen? Amen. Mike, can you close us in prayer? Or Brian, or whoever? Or do whatever you're doing next? I don't know.